the final video for the SAT reading section, and in this video we are going to be looking at what I like to call paired questions. What I mean by this is that you will often have a number of questions that are better answered if we look at them as a pair or a question with part A and part B. So you will often have a random question asking something about the passage, and another question that follows it, which would go like, what choice provides the best evidence for the previous question? And you have to identify a line or a quote in the passage that would support your case for the option you have selected in the previous question. I will be giving more examples about this later. I think you probably already understand the questions I'm referring to. These are really nice questions, to be honest, because they are often easy to answer because you have a chance to confirm whether your answer is correct in the next question. So if you do not find an option that supports your answer or a quote that supports your answer, you know it's definitely wrong, and this means that it allows you to it increases your chances of getting those two questions correct together. The disadvantage is that if you get either part wrong, it's likely that you do not get any of the two questions correct, but it's often easy to get the answers in paired questions. So this is what it will look like. So you'll have a passage. So it may ask something about, it may ask some substantive material. There'll be 4 options, and then they will ask you to identify one of the following options that will support your answer to the first question or to the previous question. So let's read the passage. Martin did not care as much for material interest, or rather he never felt a need to. It came to him as no surprise when on his 17th birthday he was gifted an ostentatiously painted sports car. He knew better than to be reckless, but not enough to appreciate his position in the scheme of things. The following day, summer break commenced. After juggling a number of ideas, he decided to join Beth on a charitable trip. He cared little for the philanthropic essence of his trip. His interests were evident in his dreamy gaze towards Beth. As a plus, he figured that the trip to India would check off another country on his bucket list. After a crescendo of from stammering to what can only be described as incessant desperation, Beth agreed to let him travel with her group. Alert of the possibility of ulterior motives, she decided to remain watchful throughout the trip. At this point, both Beth and Martin were unaware of how much would change by the time they returned. Yeah, sorry for the cliche cliffhanger, I just needed to end it over there. And also, once again, if you did not know any of the words that I have used, although it's relatively simple, I mean, it is pretty simple, the words I've used, but there are some good words here and there. Just have a look in the dictionary. It is great for vocabulary building. I mean, like words like ostentatiously or flamboyantly or things like that are really good words that are frequently used in your SAT, and if you do a bit of writing here and there, they're good words to use. Anyways, the question is, what was Martin's primary intention of embarking on this trip? And then they're asking you what choice would support the previous question. So now there are 2 ways to approach this. We can now answer this question using the first approach. The first approach is to identify 3 possible options, not 3, just the possible options in the first question that could be the answer, right? So things that are talked about in the passage. So from the passage, if we recall correctly, Martin really does not have any motive to experience another facet of life. He's pretty reckless and pretty happy, and really does not acknowledge that he's in a better position relative to others, so that's out of question. We do know that he's embarking on the trip that is and the trip is charitable. We do know that it's happening in another country, India, and we do know that he wants to get closer to Beth, right? So these are possible answers to the question. Now what we'll do is that we'll try and look for we'll try and look at each of the lines below, so lines 1 to 2, 7 to 8, 9 to 11, and 11 to 13, and try and see whether any of those quotes would correspond to either of these options, right? And we'll eventually find that they do. If we look at lines 7 to 8, after juggling a number of ideas, he decided to join a bet on a charitable trip. We see that it corresponds to option B. Lines 1 to 2 are very vague, it does not correspond to any option. Lines 14 to 16, which is after it just describes the action of him begging to get onto the trip, getting on the group for the trip, and it does not really show much in terms of what his intention was. It just shows that he wants to get on that trip, not why he wants to get on the trip. So option D does not correspond to anything either. If you look at 9 to 11, he cared little for the philanthropic essence of this trip. His interests were evident in his dreamy gaze towards Beth. So what this shows is that no, this corresponds to D, getting closer to Beth, and then we can arrive at a better final answer, because if you look at options 9 to 11 precisely, to get through, we see that he cares little for the charity that's going to happen in this trip. He is primarily interested with Beth, and this nullifies B as a possible answer, and therefore, by looking at the correspondence between the options in these two questions, and by first approaching one and then looking at whether question 2 would support the option we chose in 1, we can arrive successfully at both the answers, that is D for 1 and C for question 2. And that is the first way you can approach this question. So identify possible answers in question 1, and then identify whether there are lines that support your answers in question 1, and then choose the most accurate option. If you it was very evident from the passage that the answer to 1 is D, in that case you can just look at all these lines, always look at all these lines and see if there is an option that explicitly supports this, because you might find when you're reading the lines that one of these lines better support another option that could be right, and that something that you might have not thought of. So always read each of the lines mentioned in the options just to make sure that you are selecting the right answer for both these questions. One good thing about these is many of the options are definitely not the answer. At least 2 of the options in the best evidence questions are definitely not the answer. When you look at them, it's very obvious, and therefore these questions tend to be easy to answer. Now the second approach is practically the opposite. So you're going to first look at possible quotes that could imply some that in this question they're asking about what is implied about Mark. So you're going to look at possible quotes that would imply something about Mark, and then look at whether what these quotes implied about Mark is present in question 1, so whether any of the options say the same thing, and then once again try and correspond them together, and you will eventually arrive at one right answer, and that is your answer for both the questions. So let's read the passage. Most people would acquiesce to the fact that at one point in their high school experience they felt different. Most people would also agree that such a feeling is rather ephemeral when they look back, and something that they shouldn't have regretted. Mark was accustomed to hearing these stories. 4 years and 8 days of high school left. He had developed a particularly beneficial camaraderie with Anya. This guaranteed him invites to parties, even though he would most probably decline. The last time he had been to a party, Mark felt isolated, reading George Orwell in the inner corner with an empty red cup in his hand to fit in. The previous party, it had been the bunker diary. Lately, Mark had been arranging words himself, in the dozens of permutations and combinations he could think of. Yet, nothing would be even mildly satisfactory. He liked to describe his interests as rather refined: contemporary dancing, theatre, and philosophy, amongst others. So in this question we're going to look at, we're first going to review the lines. So we look at lines 1 to 3, just a general introduction to the passage. It's very introductory. It really does not talk about Mark, and therefore it can't imply anything about Mark, so we definitely know 1 to 3 is irrelevant. If we look at lines 6 and 7, does not really imply anything about Mark as well. It is very vague. Once again, the introductory, just introducing the character. So we know that line 6 and 7 are pretty much irrelevant too. And in your real SATs, you will also find options that are rather almost immediately irrelevant, and which makes it much easier for these kind of questions. If we look at 11 to 12, we see that he's reading George Orwell alone in the corner. This suggests he's isolated, he's lonely, does not have friends. It's explicitly stated as well, saying that he felt isolated, but it does suggest something about Mark, and the first question asks something about Mark. So we can keep that in mind. Similarly, we'll notice that 18 to 20 does suggest something about Mark. It talks about his interests being rather refined and what his interests are. So let's get that in. Now, when we're looking, 11 to 12 suggests he's isolated. None of the options in question 1, neither A, B, C, or D suggest are talking about his isolation. But when we look at D, we'll also see that option B in question 1 is talking about his interests, and the idea of him thinking his interests are more refined suggests that he thinks his interests are better than most people's, and we'll see that B and D quite well correspond to each other, because the use of the word refined kind of also suggests that and implies that Mark finds his interest to be superior, better than that of others. And so we'll immediately notice this correspondence, and we'll be able to say, right, question B and the answer for question 1 is B, the answer for question 2 is D, and that is the correct answer as well, right? And this is the second approach. So you're looking at the evidence first, and then you're looking back at the questions, right? You can do it either way, really. Though if you're doing it the second way, it is ideal that you know what you're looking for. You should know the passage quite well. So if you're reading strategies to scan and then look at the questions, it's advisable that you look at the first question first and then the evidence question, so you already have an idea for what you're looking for. But if you do have a reading strategy where you read the passage really well, understand it, and probably even highlight, underline things, so you're completely understanding the passage, you already probably know what you're looking for, and so you can just read the quotations and correspond it to the first question. Either strategy is fine when it comes to these questions. Look at what works best for you, and the key to these questions is really just to answer them as a pair. And that is the end of the reading section, actually. Thank you. Have a look at the writing section and the mathematics section. It might be helpful. I hope you found the reading section beneficial, and I hope you do well in your SATs, in case this is the last video you're watching. Thank you.